Hello and welcome to this conversation. Thank you so much for wanting to be a part of this and for joining us today. As always, I'm Abbie. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and here's what I know. Our communication creates our social worlds. The claim that communication creates our social worlds means that communication is a constitutive force. In other words, it has the ability to create, to make things happen. And so when I'm talking to you, when we are in relationship with each other, when we are having a conversation, we're creating something. That maybe feels hard for people to wrap their heads around sometimes, but I'd encourage you to kind of sit with that and think about, what does that mean? What does that mean to you? So again, communication creates our social worlds. It is to say that when we look at our communication, when we choose to be intentional around our communication, it means that we're being intentional about the social world that we're creating. Today we're talking to Dr. Mike Hemphill, who is just an incredible person. I'll let you read more about him in the description, and also you'll hear him tell us about himself in a minute, so I won't spoil that right now. One of the things I was curious to talk about with Mike today is to ask, how does he define communication? And I'd ask you to be thinking about that for yourself. How do you define communication? Another question I'd have you keep in mind as you listen to today's conversation is, where does meaning come from? That's a question that Mike has spent a lot of time thinking about, and you'll hear us talk about that today too. Okay, so with all that in mind, let's jump right in.
Hi, Mike. Thanks so much for being here today.
Hi, Abbie. Thank you for inviting me. I really am excited about the conversation we're going to have today.
Awesome. Before we jump into our conversation, I'm wondering if you can give me and my listeners a little introduction to who you are. And I'm always keeping in mind that I know you can't hit on all of the most important facets or everything about your life, so don't feel like you have to cover it all. But I just wonder what you would share that you think might be important for people to know about you as we go into this conversation together.
Sure. Well, I've spent most of my career was spent in higher ed, and I've been a student of communication basically my entire life, it feels like. But I was 24 years as a faculty member and a department chair and a dean at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, and in the Department of Communication, and then spent a couple of years at the Clinton School of Public Service, which when it first opened up in 2005, where I was a faculty member and an academic dean there, teaching communication and leadership and conflict. Taught a course that I called Conflict Transformation. And then spent some years in Shreveport, Louisiana, 4 years at Centenary College, an outstanding liberal arts college. I was provost there. And then I came back to Little Rock in 2014 to help build, and now I co-direct a national leadership program that the Clinton Foundation runs in partnership with the George W. Bush Presidential Center in Dallas, Texas. But everything about my career has been organized and focused around communication. In the study of human interaction, and more from what we used to in the old days call an applied perspective, which was the interest was always in how we got things done with communication. And did my graduate work at the University of Iowa, and so that's been the focus of my work. And then tried to in my career follow in the scholar practitioner tradition. So I was very fortunate all those years I was at Arkansas Little Rock. The university had a very strong metropolitan mission. And so the focus was on, how we export our expertise to the community and to help the community face the challenges that it was facing. And I just loved that aspect of the work that we did. And so it was really more about putting our knowledge and our ideas to work to see how they worked, and sort of exposing students to that. Which was always really exciting.
I see myself as kind of working in the same way. I like how you put that of, maybe having one foot in the door of the scholarly world and one foot in the door of the practicing side of things. And that's where I hope for this podcast to kind of exist, because why should, all of these incredibly helpful tools and the language and the ideas of a theory like CMM only exist to work in theory when it could be put into practice in a way that, helps real people in their real lives and their real relationship and their real communicating. And so I'm curious, maybe, as we keep talking, to hear more about that journey or what that transition or the balancing of both of those has been like for you, of existing in, academia and also out in the practicing world.
It's funny you say that. It reminds me of an experience I had when I was in graduate school. I think it was in my third year at the University of Iowa, and we'd invited in a really, really major name in our field, a communication theorist. And I got in an argument, and he came in as a guest, sort of did a visiting lecture thing in a seminar we were having. And I got into an argument with him. And it was one of those situations where it was like, halfway into it, I realized, I'm arguing with this guy.
Yeah.
Like, what are you doing? I mean, what are you thinking? But he was so adamant about, communication theorists should focus on theory, and it's somebody else's responsibility to take that and apply it in some meaningful way. And I kept challenging him on, why can't you do both? Why can't you, as you think about this, why can't you test it in the real world and then let people know how it worked out? And he got really upset with me. And I just finally decided, well, I should probably let it go. And so I did. But
it feels like a natural step to me to go from theory to practice. And I think it's unreasonable to expect that people outside of academia or outside of the world of theory, people that, are not like us and did not dedicate all of their studies to communication, that how are they supposed to access it if the people who have some connection to, that theory aren't able to at least help with, and I see it as like translating it, not that it's an entirely different language, but translating it in a way to make it accessible to people that don't have that same foundation, I guess.
Yeah. And, and I do think, as I look back on that, and that was that's grad school was a long time ago. So we're talking 1978.
Mm-hmm.
But even back then, like in my area of organizational communication, there was such a hard effort to legitimize the discipline of communication, because for so long, and even still today, it is seen by a lot of people as an art, not a science. And I think part of that establishing itself as a discipline was taking a hard line on things like, we're going to have people who theorize about how communication happens, and it's up to other people, like technicians, take scientific theory and apply it to real world situations. Other people need to take this and apply it. It was actually one of the things that really excited me when I first started studying CMM, when I first met Barnett Pierce and Kim Pierce, to see the way in which they had framed their work around, grounding their ideas in the practical application of them. And it seemed like such a powerful approach to me.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this is a good point where I'm just curious about your perspective on how you define communication, because I have in my head maybe an idea of, when I say, this is a podcast about communication, or I'm talking about communication, I study communication, I have a communication perspective. I have in my head some ideas of what that means, but I think it's so expansive. And I just want to keep finding new ways to put it into, again, more accessible language for people. So I'm just curious, after, all your years of experience, what has that added up to be how you would define communication now, or how you understand it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think about, I go all the way back to when I was a kid. And I grew up in a I'm sure there's a term for it, but I grew up in a highly verbal storytelling family.
Yeah.
And so when I was a kid, I was the youngest of four kids, but my mom and dad, my brother and two sisters and I would sit down every evening for dinner. And our dinners would last anywhere from 30, 45 minutes to, we could go 2.5 hours, just engaged in conversation. A lot of times it was like what we did during the day, or something somebody had read, or my dad, politics, or whatever it might be. And it was always my sister Mary Lou and I trying to make each other laugh. And or some of us getting mad or getting angry and arguing over particular ideas or whatever it was. I mean, we were always engaged in that. And it was to the point that when I would have friends come over and spend the night, a lot of my friends were like super intimidated. They couldn't believe my family was so,
Yeah.
I'd go to their house and couldn't believe they would eat dinner and not say a word while they were eating. It just seemed so odd to me. But and I think this reveals more about me and what a huge nerd I must have been when I was a kid. I remember really thinking about meaning.
Yeah.
About how meaning happens. And I was really, for a long time, really focused on the privacy of our thoughts. And the idea that other people have no idea what I'm thinking. And conversely, I have no idea what other people are thinking, but that somehow in that, with that given, we manage to communicate with one another where we can develop this shared understanding. And so, I mean, I've always thought about that. And even when I think about getting into college and majored in communication, that's the thing I was most interested in, is like answering the question is, where does meaning come from? And it seems to me that in a lot of approaches to communication, meaning is the most mysterious thing, but it's the thing that is just accepted as a given in most treatments of communication, and that it is. And so you give that, and then you're worried about everything else. The other thing, and I feel like I'm not answering your question, but I'm getting to it, I think.
Yeah, it's all a part of it. I understand. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the other thing for me is the history of the reification of communication, treating the process of communication as if it's a real thing.
Yeah.
And for some people, it's like we talk about treating meaning as if it's a commodity that you give this, you transfer from yourself to somebody else.
Right.
And there's a lot of paradigms that are based on that metaphor of a commodity exchange. Early in my teaching career, again, long ago, when we used to show films, not videotapes. This is before we didn't have videotapes back, but we showed films. And one of the films we had an animated model of communication. And it was these two cartoon heads with each other, with an airplane inside the head of one person, where these people were loading boxes into the plane, flying out the mouth of, I'm not making this up, flying out the mouth of the one character and into the ears of the other, where they would then unload the boxes. And this was this was their way of representing, this is what happens in the communication process. Highly disturbing image when you watched it. It was like, I don't think I want to do that, right. That kind of thing. But there's a strong gravitational pull towards that idea that meaning is reified and is real. And so I see a good portion of my early career in communication, that's what I was trained in, this kind of positivistic causal notion of, if you do X in the construction of a message, then Y will happen. And wanting to believe that was tangible like that. There was a systems researcher theorist by the name of Berrien, who used to talk about systems as clouds, and that and talking about the boundaries of systems, that they're like clouds. And when you're in an airplane, and that when you're outside of the system, and when you're inside the system, but you really can't. It's real fuzzy where the boundary is, right? When you're in
interesting.
Communication is I think about communication in the same way. And so we know that there's something cognitive that happens when people communicate, and we know that it generates, that our words and our behaviors and the experience generates within us information, feelings that influence our behaviors in ways that we're able to get things done. See, there's that background of mine of how we look at communication as ways of getting things done.
Yeah.
And that the evidence of effective communication then is the clues that our experience give us that, in fact, we do have a shared understanding with someone. So you and I see something, you and I, go to a movie and we see a movie and we both cry at the movie. Then we have a sort of experiential data there that suggests that at some level it resonated emotionally with us in a similar way. And for me, the communication process is just that process of sharing clues and reading the tea leaves of our behaviors to see just how well those clues have been interpreted.
Yeah, I am really resonating with everything you're saying about your experience with communication and kind of this, if this is said or if this communication happens, then this outcome is made. Because I think before I even started like formally studying communication, I was aware, or, upon reflection, I become even more aware that I would say like my high school self got really good at understanding and maybe seeing some of these patterns of, if I act this way, then people respond to me in this way. Always, I'm trying to act in a way where people respond favorably to me when I'm in a leadership position, when I'm in a classroom position. And one example I can think that, maybe demonstrates kind of the even nuance level at which I was like obsessing about this is when I'm in the classroom, I'm balancing this perception of, I don't want my classmates to see me as like too much of a nerd or a teacher's pet. So I'm kind of balancing this. I want to seem cool to them, but I also do want to be the teacher's favorite person. And I want to be smart and I feel smart and I want that to be shown. I'm kind of these two very different perceptions of me trying to balance in the same world of a classroom. And I think that was probably not healthy to the extent that I would say I had kind of an obsessive relationship to that. And that I would say came out through like people pleasing. Mm-hmm. I still had this understanding of communication, whether I would call it that or not at the time, but communication as this force that I had control over. I knew that I was communicating something about myself. And I ask what your definition of communication is. And I want to ask everybody what their definition of communication is, because I feel like I need help making mine more succinct. Because in my eyes, I'm like, communicating is living. Living is communicating. Like when I say I did communication studies, I feel like I'm saying I did human being studies, because you're communicating every moment. Verbally, yes, but where you spend your money communicates something. Where you spend your time communicates something. The language you use is communicating something about you. And so I just see, and I'm continuing to try to see everything through this lens of communication in my life. And it just seems so far reaching to me. The more I get into it, I see even more nuance and even more layers. But the meaning too is really crucial to me. And it is interesting that you say that a lot of theories kind of take it for granted, but that's one of the most compelling parts of CMM for me, and helpful in my own life. Helpful not just in a theoretical way, but in a practical way, that I now go out into the world and have this, kind of lens on of what meaning am I making? And I'm reflecting on myself, and I'm asking, is that serving me that I see it that way? What if I saw it in a different way? And just going through that practice to me is incredibly helpful. And that's kind of what I'm like, how do I get that into the hands of more people?
I keep coming back to for me personally, I've always come back to the notion of sort of this paradigm that we're so steeped in with communication as communication as a means to an end. Mm-hmm. And I think and there's so many of these moments of working with CMM, and I've had so many aha moments. Yeah. But for me, one of the important ones was thinking about the whole notion of coordination and coherence. Mm-hmm. And at some point in one of his book chapters, Barnett, uses the example of dance as, a coordinated act, and he says something really important there that it's easy to gloss over. That all dance is coordinated behavior, right? It's just that some people are more coordinated at it than others.
Right.
And so in a way, the dance is the given part. And so when I think about communication, I don't think about what it is we do, what do we say, or I think more about the coordination in the coherence element, that as social human beings, we necessarily coordinate our behavior with one another. Mm-hmm. And in order to do that, we also have to impose some coherence to it in some way. And to me, that's the focus. I mean, so when you ask, what's my definition of communication? I would say that it is anything and everything that contributes to the coordinated or impacts the coordinated behavior among people and provides them the mechanism by which they cohere those actions in a way that's meaningful for them. And so it almost flips it. In my mind, it almost flips the way you think about communication.
Right.
Like when I was teaching public speaking, you look at the speech, the public presentation as the means to the end of getting the audience, to persuade the audience, as opposed to thinking in terms of I'm in a situation right now where me and a group of people are going to come to some coordinated position on something, and there are a number of ways in which we can influence that coordinated behavior. Yeah. I mean, there are the frameworks that we create. The way I've organized my message, what sometimes we call the scaffolding that we use to construct that message. There's the responses from the audience. There's the things I do in the moment will open up the conversation in particular ways, all of which will generate the world that we're making while we're in that process. And there's something else about that, Abbie, that I came to a realization a long time ago. For my students, I used to refer to it as the illusion of stability. And I've used this idea, especially when I was teaching in conflict courses in conflict, and why we resist change. And the whole idea was that even though we were presented with, and I think all of us understand that we live in a very dynamic environment, things are changing all the time.
Yeah,
that's overwhelming if you really stop to contemplate all the ways in which your world is changing. Yeah, and so we have a tendency to create this symbolic illusion of stability to convince ourselves that things aren't changing as much as they really are, because that's the story we tell ourselves to help us move forward in the day. Otherwise, you're just completely overwhelmed with the reality that's around you. And I see communication in the same way. I mean, there is a certain illusion that we create about the process.
Yeah.
You have to sort of talk about it in static ways because we haven't developed the capacity to really understand it in its dynamic sense.
Yeah.
Even when you're speaking authentically about communication, you're relying on these illusions that we create about the process.
I guess I would say I'm an advocate then for communication's sake, and almost of like, you can say, okay, well, I want to persuade this audience of this. If you're thinking public communication, and you could, do if X, then Y, and, try to follow this formula that makes communication feel really static and, something that you can hold in the palm of your hand when it really is this dynamic thing. And so I feel like, CMM frames it as communication and bettering your communication in the interest of creating a better social world and, communication being a means to that end. And I feel like that is a helpful way to frame it, that then, all of these other things can fall into place behind that. But for me, communication for communication's own sake, the benefits kind of come on their own, I think, if you take that perspective, at least for me.
No, I think you're right. I think, this last fall, I taught a graduate course I was back at the Clinton School. And it's a course on communication and the leadership of social change. And we were actually using Arthur Jensen's and Rob Penman's books on cosmopolitan communication. Yeah. And so I think this is a really good example of the sort of thing I'm talking about, because we were at one point in the class, we were talking about the different contexts, cultural context and relational context and episode, the context of episode. And so the question naturally arises of, well, how do you define the episode? As if there was some resource we could go to, or measuring stick we could apply that says in this conversation or in this day's worth of interactions, here were the different episodes that occurred. And so I would share with my students is that's not really the point. The point isn't that we can objectively identify what the episodes are. The real point is do you understand that we have a tendency to punctuate our interactions in ways that can be defined as episodes. And the real thing is in the moment, can you develop the capacity within yourself to where in the moment, you recognize it as an episode and you're curious about whether the other person recognizes it as an episode, or in what different ways what the nuances of it are, or what does it mean when you do and they don't. And that's the insights. That's what moves the shared understanding forward. That's what contributes to the making of the social world that we're talking about, is that we're thinking about things in that particular way. I'm just making me think of something else too. In small group communication, you'd get 10 different textbooks, and the textbooks in small group communication would always have, at the very beginning, the very first chapter was how many people constitute a small group. And I can remember articles written where people had really big arguments about this. No more than 5, no more than 7, 9, and all with really good reasons. And then I can't remember who it was, but I remember I got a textbook to review, and I used it because in the first chapter they said numbers don't matter with a small group, that a small group is made up of any collection of people who all believe they're members of the same small group. And I thought, yeah, exactly. That it's just that the identification of the small group is in and of itself this illusion, this artificial symbolic put on it, and it can obscure and then if we focus all of our attention on that artificial symbolic illusion, then we're losing all of the attention that we should be placing to what's actually happening while we're in the moment. As you were saying, what's happening when we treat communication for communication's sake.
Yeah, that's good. I'm curious about how your experience of teaching communication has deepened your understanding compared to when you were a student of communication.
Oh, interesting. Well, probably in 2 ways. And I still do, I love teaching. And there's just something about the classroom. And it was because of the teachers that I had. It's interesting. I started by saying, I grew up in a family that were storytellers. And then the most important teachers I had in college when I was an undergraduate, people like Jerry Butler and Alan Ward and Steve Runnebaum and Wayne Chapman, they all taught us with stories. It was never the case that they came into class and went through their lecture notes for the day. It was like they came into class with their lecture notes, but every class was sort of like, let's just see where this goes. Let's just take this where you all want to take it. And so I learned from them, and that's always the way I approached my classes, or I tried to at least. And I can remember walking out of some of my classes where I took 4 or 5 pages of lecture notes in and didn't get halfway down the first page. Because the conversation, you sort of went where the conversation went. But the reason I'm sharing that with you is because what that enabled for me as a teacher is I learned a lot from my students, because it wasn't just because I think I was willing to share experiences with them that I had. They were willing to do the same. And so I heard different and saw the different ways in which people approached the communication challenges. And it gave me different and I think, better insights. I want to tell you this story real quickly about teaching public speaking. So this was very early in my career, but for most of my career, I taught a required first-year communication course. Every student in the university had to take it to graduate. And there was a public speaking component to it. And so it was that in and of itself, I loved that challenge, right? I love the challenge of having students that were only there because they were forced to be there in their minds, and didn't want to be there anyway because, Hemphill's going to make us give a speech.
Yep.
Early on in my career, I'm teaching this class. It comes time for our speeches, and I always use the system where I'd let students volunteer, but if there's a slightest hesitation, I had a list ready, and I would just name somebody on the list. And so I did that one. I named this young man, and he walks up to the front of the room, and I notice he's carrying a brown paper grocery bag, not a plastic. We didn't have plastic. It was one of those, large brown. He goes up in front of the class. He looks at all of us. He has the bag in one hand. You whap. He opens. He kind of slings it and opens it up, and he puts it on his head. And it's just the bag. There's nothing, no eye holes cut out, no mouth hole cut out.
Okay.
And as I say that, and I'm sharing this with you, I'm sure you're thinking to yourself, that seems odd. But in the context of our class where we talked about attention getters and everybody's doing creative things. And so I just thought, like the rest of the class, I'm sure thought, well, this is his attention getter.
Mm-hmm.
And it was about 2 minutes into his speech. And you could see, I could see it sitting in the back of the class. I could see it just kind of pass through the whole room as everybody realized, including me, he's not taking the bag off his head. And so for 7 minutes, he gives this speech with this bag on his head and no eye holes, no mouth hole, which meant for 7 minutes, all we heard was, didn't hear anything.
Yeah.
You couldn't hear anything he was saying. He gets to the end, and it's like, and he stops and he pulls the bag off his head and he's perspiring. His face is all flushed. It's just, and looking back on it at some point, as the instructor, I probably should have stopped him.
Yeah.
But I for whatever reason, I didn't.
Mm-hmm.
Still, this is the other great thing. And anybody out there that's taught public speaking in that kind of environment will understand this. Pulls the bag off. The class just gave him a great round of applause. Had no idea what he was talking about.
Yeah.
Nothing about nothing. So after class, I had him come over to me and I just said, man, what was that? And he was very, I mean, he just said, I'm terrified of giving speeches. And it's knowing that people are looking at me and it makes me so nervous. And then he said to me, he said, it looked pretty stupid, didn't it? And I didn't know what to say. I mean, I said, well, now that I've seen it, yeah, it looked pretty silly.
Now that you mention it, yes.
Yeah. I wouldn't have known before.
You brought it up.
Yeah. So what I told him was, you're always looking for a teaching moment. I said, well, isn't that interesting that in communication, oftentimes the harder we work to keep something from happening, like in our relationships in particular, that whatever it is we're doing to make it not happen is actually making it happen. You get the complete opposite result. And he was kind of looking at me. I said, so you didn't quite understand it. I said, so what gives you the most concern? He said, well, people looking at me. And I said, what's the one thing you made sure of when you put that bag on your head? And he said, oh, yeah, everybody was looking at me. And I said, exactly. Yeah. And so I worked with him over the next week and he came back and gave his speech without the bag on his head and everything was fine. But there were those kind of moments where I learned a lot about communication from the way in which my students approached it and in the way they shared it with the group. And so it was always, my lectures were always me amplifying the ideas we were talking about by sharing stories, mainly from my personal life. I would tell so many stories about my brother and my sisters. One of the constant evaluations I would get from students at the end of a semester was that, there weren't any questions about Hemphill's brother, Tom, on the test. And,
that's funny.
Yeah.
They're like, I've been taking notes all this time on the family dynamics.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah.
That's funny. You're making me think one of the illusions of communication is that it's taken for granted that we'll just stumble into effective communication in our lives.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I'm connecting that even to, I know what is, not unique to that story you just told, but a really broad fear of public speaking or, public communicating in that way that maybe in some ways trickles down to even interpersonal communication. But I wonder if, part of that fear comes from this unspoken expectation that you just should know how to do it. Maybe we wouldn't be so afraid of communicating, which I think is a vulnerable act. So I think that's where some of that fear comes. But maybe that fear would be lessened if everybody came into it with like, all right, we're going to figure this out. We're all actually starting from zero. We're not kidding ourselves by thinking that we're already at 99%.
Right.
Yeah.
That's interesting. In a very flippant way with absolutely no basis in any research whatsoever. I used to tell my students that, so when you're a communication professor and you're doing public speaking, I always worried about even bringing up communication anxiety. Mm-hmm. Because I thought there's a certain number of my students who weren't nervous about speaking suddenly would be because I'm talking. Mm-hmm. It's like, wait a minute, I should be nervous about this. I would tell my students, I think a big part of it is when you learn to communicate. I mean, when you start interacting with the world around you and start noticing responses, and you're cognizant of that, right? That age of 3 or 4, whatever. So just think about it, how exciting that must be. That has to be one of the most exciting moments of our entire existence, is when and yet everybody's reaction to it is basically to tell us to shut up. And so I'm around adults with little kids who are just learning to talk. They spend more time, not now, daddy's talking, don't interrupt. And it's like, no. And then you go to school and, you can't talk unless you raise your hand first. And, I always loved going to, when we would go to friends' houses that had kids that were in elementary school, and you'd be at the dinner table or whatever, and they're raising their hands at home to,
Yeah.
And then you get into school in the communication class, and suddenly somebody says, okay, now you can talk, get up and say something to everybody. I do think you're right. I think there is that kind of expectation, going back, got this kid with the grocery sack on his head. I've used that example. I use that example in my classes all the time. After that happened, eye contact in public speaking is a good example of I think what we're talking about, which is it's something that makes people really, really nervous. Although I always notice my students in the student union with their friends talking about what they did the previous weekend were leaning into their conversation, looking at each other, smiling, all animated. I mean, it's not as if it's a skill we don't know how to use, but in that context of public speaking. But I would then challenge my students, why do you look? Why do we want you to look at the members of the audience? And what's interesting is that oftentimes they feel that it's a persuasive technique.
Yeah.
So a lot of people think, so if you look at the audience, then the audience, perceives you as being authentic and sincere, and that makes you more influential in your message. And isn't that fascinating? Because it suggests then that communication is something we do to the audience, and so now we're back in that causal thing. Instead, what I would tell them is, instead, think about, as you're giving your speech, you want to be able to modify your message, just like you do in a lot of your interpersonal conversations. You want to modify your message based on the reaction you're getting from the audience. You should look at your audience, because you can tell when you've said something they don't quite understand, and so you need to elaborate a little bit more on that. You are letting them. We use a CMM idea. You're letting your audience co-author the presentation that you're giving.
Yep.
And so you don't memorize a speech. You don't read it from a manuscript. You know what it is you want. You organize things. You think about word choice, but then you make that speech literally with the audience and you can't do that if you're not looking at the audience. The most absurd example of this, when I was in junior high, I had a speech teacher tell us that if it bothers you to look in people's eyes, then just look at their eyebrows instead.
Yeah.
Right? Because he said they can't tell. They think you're looking at them in their eyes.
Yeah.
As if that was a trick you're playing on the audience I want to make you think I care, so I'm going to look at you in your eyes.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm looking at your eyebrows. And I don't know if you've ever done that before, but if you do, I guarantee you there comes a point where whatever it is you're talking about, you get distracted because you start thinking, eyebrows are really weird, really a weird part of the facial anatomy. I mean, they're really hard. You look at people, because in a public speaking context that I'm talking about, that's one of the ways we invite them into the conversation that we're having with them.
Absolutely. I'm seeing it as like, if you're like, oh, well, just look at their eyebrows, or, oh, well, we make eye contact to, persuade people or something. It's like a shallow version of what I see, communication as being this like really rich thing of like, no, you make eye contact with someone to, like you said, it's an invitation. It's a connection on this like human level of I'm seeing you, you're seeing me, there's nowhere to hide. And to me, I'm like, that's, compelling again is the only word I have to use, but it's like, that's why I enjoy studying and considering communication, is because it unlocks a world that's really rich to me. I'm not looking at it because it's this surface level thing of how to control people or influence people, which that again comes with it. But it's like, there's a difference between, again, communication for communication's sake and, influence, positive relationships, effective communication being byproducts of those things. I think that's different than, communication in order to specifically try to get those things. Like you kind of have to pretend like you don't want them maybe.
Mm-hmm. So
and
how much of that
emerge.
do you think is this richness that you're talking about? How much of this is a result of the challenge of trying to understand what's really a very complex process? I mean, I wonder sometimes, do you think that when confronted with those kinds of complex processes, we opt for a overly simplistic mm-hmm. explanation of it?
Yeah. I know I probably can't speak for everybody because like there is nothing more that I love than like really looking into something complex and, almost like it's a game to me of like, let me try to find the best words to express this. Or, again, communication goes so much more beyond the verbals, but what is the body language I'm using? What are the themes we're talking about? What's the context we're considering? To me, that's like such a worthwhile thing to spend my mental energy on and spend my time considering and studying. Yeah, to me, it's rewarding to look into that. But I know, one of the criticisms of CMM is that it's so complex or feels, convoluted. Right. But my response to that is the world is so complex. Mm-hmm. And so if CMM is going to do even a fraction of translating that or making sense of it, making meaning of it, then CMM also does have to be complex. It doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means it's going to take a little extra energy to break it down for ourselves or to make it real for us, to put it into practice for ourselves.
Okay, that is all for part 1 of our conversation with Dr. Mike Hemphill, but you can join us next week, next Monday, for part 2, where we'll continue to talk about some of these illusions that we find ourselves believing and, as always, just digging deeper into communication and our shared love of the study and practice of it. Some next turns to take away from this conversation, kind of what I'm left thinking about and where I want to go, is to keep thinking about communication for communication's own sake. I think it's worth taking time to reflect, like, if we are thinking about why do we make eye contact when we're public speaking or even when we're just in one-on-one conversations, we've maybe been fed some shortcuts or loopholes about how to make that feel easier, or almost how to make something that is supposed to be about a connection between two people a disconnection, and kind of cheating that system in order to ease our own discomfort maybe. I don't know, there's still a lot of things to be thinking about around that, and I wonder if you maybe have some different ideas or thoughts around that as well. So keep ruminating on these ideas until we meet again next Monday in this conversation. As always, I am supported by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. Some podcast next turns that I'd like to leave you with are, please to review and rate the show, follow it wherever you listen. Also share an episode with a friend. Maybe this episode was meaningful to you. Maybe you're reflecting back on a previous episode you've listened to and you know someone in your life that you think would appreciate it. Be considering who you want to invite into this conversation and do that by sharing an episode with them. And again, if you do have ideas, thoughts, feelings, questions about any of the stuff that we've talked about today or in a previous episode, please reach out to me. You can do that in a couple ways. One, I am on Instagram. It is at Stories Live, Stories Told Pod. You're welcome to comment on a post or DM me on there. You're also welcome to comment on the YouTube videos that I have up. My account is Stories Live, Stories Told. Or you can connect with me through the Stories Live, Stories Told website, which is just storieslivestoriestold.com. Use the Contact Me page there, and we can keep this conversation going. Thank you for showing up today. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this conversation. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Live, Stories Told.